The moment my dad, David, switched the television channel when my mom was gone changed my relationship with him forever, bringing me to the most exciting moments of my life. It all started on a hot summer day a couple of months ago. The living room was quiet except for the low hum of the air conditioner. Outside, the sun beat down mercilessly, casting golden streaks through the half-closed blinds. I was stretched out on the couch, flipping through channels on the television with a sense of boredom that only comes from long summer days. My dad, David, sat a few feet away in his recliner, scrolling aimlessly through his phone. Mom had gone out shopping with some friends earlier that morning and wouldn't be back until dinner at 6 p.m. With college on the horizon, I felt caught between being a kid and something more. It was a strange limbo, one where I wasn't sure where I fit anymore. My relationship with Dad had always been fine. He was a good guy, quiet, reserved, and practical, but we'd never been close in the way I sometimes wished we were. He was the type of man who didn't talk much about feelings, and I was the kind of son who had a lot he didn't know how to say. "Anything good on?" Dad's voice broke the silence, low and rumbling. "Nah," I muttered, clicking through endless reruns and reality shows. "It's all garbage." "Figures," he said with a dry chuckle, setting his phone on the side table. "You want to watch a movie or something? Maybe something new?" I glanced at him, a little surprised. Dad wasn't usually the one to suggest anything. "Yeah, sure," I said, shrugging. "What do you want to watch?" He stood and stretched, wandering over to the television stand where the remote for the streaming service sat. "Let's see what's on." Something different. As Dad flipped through the options, I sank further into the couch. The light outside had dimmed slightly, and the room felt cooler now, cozier. After scrolling past a dozen action movies, he paused on a thumbnail that looked unfamiliar, a dark screen with a moody title and small text. "What's this?" I asked, sitting up a little. Dad clicked it without answering, and the screen faded to black before the opening credits rolled. It wasn't something I'd ever seen before. The narrator's voice was deep and hushed, as clips of city streets and lonely faces flickered across the screen. Within minutes, I realized it was one of those intimate documentaries, the kind that explored hidden lives, secrets, and desires most people were too scared to talk about. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, suddenly aware of the tension creeping into the room. Dad didn't say anything as the documentary played on, his eyes fixed on the screen with a quiet intensity. I tried to act casual, glancing at him out of the corner of my eye, but there was no mistaking it. He wasn't zoning out or scrolling his phone. He was actually watching. The first story was about a man who spent years hiding his true self from his family. The footage was raw and emotional, and I could feel something in my chest tightening as I watched. I'd always avoided this kind of stuff. It felt too real, too close to things I didn't want to think about. But sitting here next to Dad, it was impossible to ignore. When the first story ended and the screen faded to black, I cleared my throat. Then something came on that was even crazier, as this was adult stuff you needed to buy, but then between two men. Dad," I said, "this is kind of weird. You sure you want to keep watching?" He looked over at me, his face calm but unreadable. "Yeah, it's fine. Interesting, don't you think? I mean, I guess." My voice trailed off as the next story began, this one even more personal than the last. I felt my stomach twist, heat creeping up my neck. It wasn't just the content, it was the fact that I was watching it with him, Dad of all people. The silence between us was almost unbearable. I glanced at him again, hoping to catch some sign that he was uncomfortable too, but he just sat there, his gaze steady. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "Dad," I said, forcing a laugh to break the tension, "why are we watching this? Mom's going to be back soon." He didn't answer right away. For a moment, I thought he was going to ignore me completely, but then he turned his head just slightly, his expression softer than I expected. "Why does it bother you so much?" I froze. "What?" "It doesn't." "It does," he said quietly, cutting me off. "I can see it." I felt like my skin was on fire. It's awkward, okay? Watching this kind of thing with you." "Why?" he pressed, his voice still calm but insistent. "What about it makes you uncomfortable?" I opened my mouth to answer but couldn't find the words. My throat felt tight, my pulse pounding in my ears. Why was he asking me this? Why now? "Forget it," I mumbled, looking away. "It's nothing." "It's not nothing," Dad said, his voice low. "Ethan, you can talk to me." The documentary droned on in the background, but I wasn't watching it anymore. I stared at my hands, my heart racing as 100 thoughts flashed through my mind. I wanted to tell him the truth. That it did bother me because I saw too much of myself in the people on the screen. That I'd spent years burying feelings I didn't understand, afraid of what they meant. But saying it out loud, that was something else entirely. "Dad," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Have you ever felt different?" The question hung between us like a weight. I didn't dare look up at him, terrified of what I might see. The silence stretched on long enough that I thought he wouldn't answer, but then, softly, he spoke. "Yeah," he said, his voice steady. "I have." My head snapped up, my eyes wide. "You have?" He nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the screen, but his expression distant, like he was remembering something. "When I was younger, it wasn't easy to understand back then. People didn't talk about it. You just kept it to yourself." I stared at him, my chest tight. "What did you do?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I tried to ignore it, pretend it wasn't there. "But that doesn't work, Ethan. You can't hide from who you are forever." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd spent so long doing exactly that, hiding, pretending, burying everything so deep I thought it might disappear, but it hadn't. It was still there, and hearing Dad say it out loud made it feel even more real. "Ethan," he said, his voice softer now, "you don't have to carry this alone. Not with me." I swallowed hard, my eyes burning. What if I don't know who I am? "That's okay," Dad said, turning to look at me. "You'll figure it out, and when you do, I'll still be here, no matter what." I was quiet for a second. "What's weird?" he asked, leaning back in his recliner. His tone was gentle but steady, like he wasn't going to let me escape the question. I couldn't look at him. My eyes darted back to the screen where another story played. Another man talking about how he'd spent years hiding, afraid of what people would think. The footage cut to him standing alone, staring at the horizon as the wind whipped through his hair. It was beautiful, in a lonely sort of way, and it made my stomach twist. "This," I muttered, gesturing vaguely toward the television, "watching this with you." Dad didn't say anything for a moment, and I could feel his eyes on me. I hated how exposed I felt, like every unspoken thought I'd buried was floating to the surface. I wanted to get up, to leave the room, but my legs wouldn't move. "You know," Dad said finally, his voice low, "I don't think there's anything wrong with it." I swallowed hard. "With what?" "With any of this, what they're talking about." I stared at the screen, but I wasn't really seeing it anymore. My hands fidgeted in my lap, my fingers picking at a loose thread on my shorts. "You don't think it's weird?" "No," Dad said simply. "I think it's human." The words hit me like a wave, and I felt my throat tighten, my chest ache. Like all the things I'd been holding in were pressing against my ribs, desperate to get out. I couldn't bring myself to say anything, so I just sat there, my heart pounding. After a moment, Dad sighed, leaning forward to touch me. "Ethan, you don't have to talk to me if you don't want to, but I'm here, and I want you to know that whatever you're feeling, whatever you're afraid of, it's okay." I bit the inside of my cheek, my vision blurring slightly. "Why are you saying this?" I asked quietly, my voice shaking. "Because I can see how much it's eating at you," he replied, "and I don't want you to feel like you have to go through it alone." I blinked quickly, trying to keep the tears at bay. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't get enough air. I'd spent years hiding, pretending that everything was fine, that I was normal, but sitting here, hearing Dad say those things, it felt like a door had cracked open, and I didn't know whether I wanted to step through or slam it shut. I started, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't know how to say it." Dad didn't push me. He just nodded, like he understood. "Take your time." I stared down at my lap, my hands trembling slightly. The words were right there, just out of reach. I could feel them building in my throat, and it was like if I didn't say them now, I never would. I think my voice faltered, and I had to force myself to keep going. "I think I'm different." The room went silent. I couldn't bring myself to look at Dad, but I could feel his presence, steady, unshaken. I waited for him to say something, anything, but the silence stretched on. I felt like I was going to fall apart. Finally, Dad spoke, his voice soft. "What do you mean by different, Ethan?" I squeezed my eyes shut, my pulse thudding in my ears. "I don't know," I said, my voice barely audible. I look at guys sometimes the way other people look at girls, and I don't know what that means, but I'm scared." It was out. The words I'd been too afraid to say for years were finally out in the open, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. My chest heaved, my hands shaking as I waited for Dad's reaction. I was terrified to look at him, to see the disappointment or confusion or whatever else I'd imagined 1,000 times before. But then I felt his hand on my shoulder, warm and firm. "Hey," he said softly, his voice steady. "It's okay, Ethan." I opened my eyes, my vision blurred with tears. "It's not okay," I choked out. "What if there's something wrong with me?" "There's nothing wrong with you," Dad said, his tone firm but gentle. "Nothing at all." I looked at him then, and the expression on his face nearly broke me. He didn't look disappointed or angry or ashamed. He just looked there, solid and unwavering, like he was trying to hold me up with nothing but his words. "You're my son," he said quietly, his hand still on my shoulder. "And I love you. Nothing's ever going to change that." I felt the tears spill over then, hot and unstoppable. I tried to turn away, to hide my face, but Dad pulled me into a hug, his arms wrapping around me tightly. I sobbed into his shoulder, all the years of fear and confusion pouring out of me like a flood. I couldn't hold back anymore. "It's okay," Dad whispered, his hand rubbing soothing circles on my back. "You don't have to be scared anymore." I don't know how long we stayed like that, me crying, Dad holding me without letting go. The world outside felt like it had disappeared, leaving just the two of us in the dim living room. I'd spent so long convincing myself that I couldn't tell anyone, that no one would understand. But Dad had proven me wrong. He was still here. He wasn't going anywhere. Eventually my tears slowed, and I pulled back, wiping at my face with the back of my hand. I felt embarrassed, exposed, but lighter too, like some of the weight I'd been carrying had finally been lifted. "Sorry," I mumbled, my voice hoarse. "Don't apologize," Dad said firmly. "You've got nothing to be sorry for." I nodded, sniffling as I tried to pull myself together. "Thanks, Dad," he smiled softly. "Always." The room felt different now, like something had shifted between us. The air was clearer, the tension gone. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was hiding anymore. "Want to finish the documentary?" Dad asked after a while, his voice light. I let out a small, shaky laugh. "Yeah, sure." He handed me the remote, and as the screen flickered back to life, I realized something. I wasn't alone anymore. Dad knew. He knew, and he still loved me. That was enough. The documentary picked up where we'd paused it earlier, though I wasn't really watching. My mind kept replaying everything that had just happened, every word I'd said, every word Dad had said back to me. "You're my son, and I love you." Nothing's ever going to change that. I swallowed hard, my throat still raw. It felt unreal, like I was floating outside my own body, watching all of this unfold. How could something I'd been terrified of for so long suddenly feel better? Not fixed, not perfect, but better. I snuck a glance at Dad. He looked calm, focused on the screen as if nothing out of the ordinary had just happened. I didn't know how he did that, how he could sit there so steady and unshaken while I felt like I was coming apart at the seams. I envied him for it. "You all right, Ethan?" Dad asked suddenly, not looking away from the screen. I jumped slightly, my fingers tightening around the remote. "Yeah," I muttered. "I'm fine." He nodded once, as if that answer was good enough for him, and we fell back into silence. The documentary was moving toward its final story now. This one about a guy who had spent decades hiding who he was, trying to live the life everyone expected of him. I stared at the screen, my chest tight as he talked about the loneliness of it all, the quiet desperation of pretending. Dad shifted in his seat, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw him glance at me. "Heavy stuff," he said quietly. "Yeah," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "It is." We watched in silence as the man on the screen talked about the moment he decided he couldn't keep hiding. It wasn't some big dramatic event, just a quiet realization that he couldn't keep pretending to be someone he wasn't. But later on, they also showed some stuff, and I felt something twist inside me, like his words were aimed directly at me, and that I got excited from what we were watching together with my dad. I knew what it felt like to hide, to lie to yourself and everyone else, to hope that if you ignored it long enough, it might go away, but it didn't go away. It just got louder. The screen faded to black, and the credits began to roll. The only sound in the room was the low hum of the air conditioner and the distant clinking of dishes from the kitchen next door. I set the remote down, my hand suddenly feeling too shaky to hold it. Dad stretched, his chair creaking slightly as he leaned back. "Well," he said, exhaling deeply, "that was something." "Yeah," I murmured, not sure what else to say. He looked over at me, his expression softer now, almost thoughtful. "You still okay?" "Yeah," I said quickly, though my chest was tight again. Dad didn't push me. He just sat there, his gaze steady. Ethan, he said after a long pause, you know you don't have to have all the answers right now, right? I frowned slightly, picking at the loose thread on my shorts. What do you mean? I mean, it's okay if you don't have everything figured out yet. You're 18, you've got time. I looked up at him surprised. But what if I never figure it out? What if I'm just like this forever? Dad's brow furrowed, and he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Like what? I hesitated, my face hot, confused. Dad let out a quiet sigh, shaking his head. Ethan, being confused doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. It means you're human. You're trying to figure out who you are. That's not something you need to apologize for. I swallowed hard, my hands fidgeting in my lap. It doesn't feel normal. What's normal? Dad asked, raising an eyebrow. Everyone's got their own version of it, but I'll tell you this. Hiding from yourself, pretending to be someone you're not, that's no way to live. I stared at him, stunned into silence. For so long, I'd felt like no one could understand what I was going through, but here he was, saying exactly what I needed to hear. I didn't know how he did it, how he always seemed to know the right thing to say, but I was grateful for it. You're not mad? I asked quietly, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Dad's face softened, and he shook his head. Mad, Ethan? Number? I could never be mad at you for being yourself. The knot in my chest loosened just a little, and I felt my eyes burn again. It's just, I don't know what I'm supposed to do, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. You don't have to do anything, Dad said gently. You just have to be honest with yourself. That's all. I nodded slowly, letting his words sink in. I'd spent so long pretending, so long hiding, that I didn't even know what being honest with myself looked like. But sitting here with Dad, I felt like maybe, just maybe, it was possible. After a moment, Dad stood up, stretching his arms over his head. Come on, he said, nodding toward the kitchen. Let's get something to eat. I think we could both use a break. I blinked up at him, surprised. Yeah, he said with a small grin. You can't spend all day thinking yourself in circles. Trust me, it doesn't help. I couldn't help but smile a little as I stood up, following him into the kitchen. The air felt lighter now, like the tension from earlier had finally started to fade. I still didn't have all the answers, but for the first time, I felt like maybe I didn't need to. Dad rummaged through the fridge, pulling out leftovers and sandwich supplies. Turkey okay? He asked, glancing over his shoulder. Yeah, that's fine, I replied, leaning against the counter as he started making the sandwiches. I watched him, still trying to wrap my head around everything that had happened. Dad wasn't perfect. He didn't have all the answers, and he didn't try to pretend that he did, but he was here. He was listening, and that was enough. You're quiet, Dad said, looking up at me. Just thinking. I admitted. He smiled faintly. That's okay. Just don't forget to eat while you're at it. I let out a small laugh, shaking my head as I grabbed a plate. Thanks, Dad. For what? He asked, handing me a sandwich. I hesitated, meeting his gaze. For being here. His smile softened, and he reached out to squeeze my shoulder gently. Always, Ethan. Always. The look in his eyes told me he was up to something I couldn't quite name. Not yet. But then he stood up and walked away, leaving me there alone, but I knew that this wasn't over. And the next day, the sandwiches sat untouched for a while, as Dad and I lingered in the kitchen, each of us pretending to be focused on something else. I took small bites, chewing slowly, as if the food itself could distract me. It couldn't. My mind was still stuck on everything we'd said, on everything I'd said. I'd admitted it, at least part of it. I'd cracked open the door I'd spent so long trying to keep locked, and the thought terrified me. Dad's reaction had been the opposite of what I feared. But still, I felt raw, like I'd peeled off a layer of skin and exposed everything underneath. And, to be honest, it seemed as if he liked it, or something. Earth to Ethan, Dad said softly, nudging my arm. I looked up to find him watching me with that same calm, steady gaze. You're thinking too hard again. I managed a small smile. Sorry. You don't have to apologize every time you feel something, you know, Dad said, setting his plate down and leaning back against the counter, arms crossed. It's okay to just let it sit. I frowned. What do you mean? He shrugged. You don't have to fix everything right away. Some things just take time. You figure them out as you go. I looked down at the sandwich in my hands, my appetite suddenly gone. What if I never figure it out? Then you keep going, he said simply. There's no deadline on understanding yourself. His words sat heavy in the air. I wanted to believe him, I really did, but it still felt impossible. I'd spent so long running from this part of me that I didn't know what it would look like to just sit with it, to let myself feel what I felt. Dad pushed himself off the counter and grabbed his plate, dropping it into the sink. "Come on," he said, turning back to me. "Let's get out of here. You need some air." I blinked at him. "What? Where are we going?" "You'll see," he replied, already heading for the front door. 5 minutes later, we were in the car. Dad rolled the windows down as we drove, letting the warm summer air whip through the cabin. It felt good, like it was clearing my head bit by bit. I didn't ask where we were going. I figured Dad would tell me if it mattered. We pulled into the parking lot of an old park on the edge of town. I recognized it immediately. It was the same place he used to take me when I was a kid. I'd spent hours here running through the grass, climbing on the playground, and begging Dad to push me higher on the swings. "You remember this place?" Dad asked as he turned off the engine and laid his hand on my leg. "A bit in a strange spot?" "Yeah," I said, a small smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. "Haven't been here in forever." "Me neither," he admitted, climbing out of the car. "Thought it might be nice to come back." We walked side by side toward the old swing set, the chains creaking softly in the breeze. The park was mostly empty, except for a couple of kids playing on the other side of the field. The sun hung low in the sky, turning everything golden. It felt peaceful in a way I hadn't expected. Dad stopped in front of the swings and nodded toward one of them. "Well, you going to sit or what?" I laughed. "Seriously?" "Come on," he said, already lowering himself onto the swing next to it. "For old time's sake." Shaking my head, I sat down and wrapped my hands around the cool metal chains. It felt ridiculous at first, like I was too big, too old for this. But then I pushed off gently with my feet, and the familiar motion took over. I swung higher and higher, the wind rushing past my face, and for a few moments I forgot about everything. I glanced over at Dad, who was swinging too, his face relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in years. "You're just a big kid, you know that?" I called to him. He laughed, his voice carrying through the empty park. "Takes one to know one." We swung in silence for a while, the creaking of the chains the only sound between us. I slowed gradually, letting the motion die out until I was just sitting there, my feet dragging through the dirt. "Why'd you bring me here?" I asked quietly, staring out at the empty field. Dad stopped swinging too, his feet planted firmly on the ground. "Because this was always the place you'd come when you needed to think. I figured it might help." I looked over at him, surprised. "You remember that?" "Of course I do," he said softly. "You'd run around out here for hours when you were a kid. You wouldn't say much, but I could tell when something was on your mind." I looked away, my throat tight. "I didn't think you noticed." "I notice more than you think, Ethan," Dad replied. "I always have." The quiet stretched between us again, but it didn't feel heavy this time. It felt safe, like the air itself had made room for what we weren't saying out loud. "I don't know what to do with all of this," I admitted finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "Everything I feel, it's so confusing. I don't know how to talk about it." "You're doing it right now," Dad said gently. I shook my head. "It's not enough. I feel like I don't know who I am." Dad was quiet for a moment before he spoke again. "You don't have to know. Not all at once." I glanced at him, my chest aching. "How can you be so calm about this?" "I feel like I'm falling apart, because I know you're going to be okay," he said, looking me straight in the eye. "You don't see it yet, but you're stronger than you think. And no matter what you figure out, no matter who you are, I'm still here." His words settled in my chest like a weight, but this time it wasn't a bad feeling. It was grounding, steadying. I looked down at the dirt beneath my shoes, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill over again. "Thanks, Dad," I whispered. He reached over and squeezed my shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. "Anytime, kid." We sat there in silence as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the park. I felt like I'd been holding my breath for years, and for the first time, I could let it out. I didn't have all the answers. Hell, I didn't have any of the answers, but I wasn't alone. That was enough for now. "Ready to head home?" Dad asked eventually, his voice low. "Yeah," I said, standing up and brushing the dirt off my shorts. As we walked back to the car, I glanced at Dad and smiled faintly. This was a good idea. He grinned back at me. "Told you I'm the parent." I laughed softly, shaking my head. "Sure, Dad, whatever you say." The drive home was quiet, the kind of comfortable silence that only happens when something important has been said. The sun had almost set, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep purple. As Dad rolled the windows down again, letting the cool evening breeze sweep through the car. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the wind hit my face, and for the first time in a long, long time, I felt lighter. When we pulled into the driveway, Dad turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, his hands resting on the steering wheel. I glanced over, half expecting him to say something, but he just looked out the windshield, lost in thought. Eventually, he looked at me and gave a small smile and then kissed me on my lips for a bit too long. "Feel any better?" he asked softly. I nodded. "Yeah, I think so," although I didn't quite know what I felt right there good. He opened his door and I followed the sound of gravel crunching beneath our feet as we walked inside. The house was quiet again, the kind of stillness that comes when no one else is home. I remembered Mom would be back soon and wondered if Dad was thinking the same thing. "You want to watch something else?" Dad asked, setting his keys on the kitchen counter. I hesitated. "I don't know, maybe." He turned to me, raising an eyebrow. "You've got that look again." "What look?" I asked, feeling my cheeks flush. "The look that says you're overthinking everything," Dad said, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "Come on, let's put something on. Something easy this time." "Fine," I muttered, rolling my eyes, though I was grateful for the distraction. I grabbed the remote as Dad flopped onto the couch, his body sinking into his usual spot on the recliner. I started scrolling through the options again, half paying attention when I landed on a new suggestion. It wasn't a documentary this time, more of a drama, but I recognized the actors from other movies I liked. The thumbnail wasn't anything special, just a simple scene of two guys sitting on a bench, talking. "What about this one?" I asked, looking at Dad. He shrugged. "Sure, hit play." I clicked it, settling back into the couch as the screen faded to black and the movie began. The opening scene was soft and quiet, filled with low music and the sound of footsteps on wet pavement. It felt different, not heavy like the documentary had been, but not light either. It was a story about friendship, about two guys who grew up together, neither of them really understanding themselves until they were older, and then eventually falling in love and, doing their things, It was subtle at first. Glances held a little too long, touches that lingered, but I saw it. I knew what it was, and I knew Dad saw it too. As the movie progressed, I could feel my stomach tightening again, that familiar knot of anxiety creeping back in. I tried to focus on the story, on the way the two characters moved closer and closer to understanding each other, but all I could think about was Dad sitting just a few feet away. What was he thinking? Was it awkward for him? Did he regret watching this with me? I stole a glance at him, my heart racing, but he looked calm, completely absorbed in the movie, his brow furrowed slightly, like he was concentrating on every word, every moment. It didn't seem to bother him at all. Halfway through the movie, one of the characters finally admitted what he was feeling, what he'd been hiding for years. The other guy didn't say anything right away, just sat there stunned. My chest felt tight as I watched it unfold, like the scene was reaching straight inside me, pulling at everything I'd tried to bury. "Ethan," Dad said quietly, pulling me out of my thoughts. I froze. "Yeah? You okay?" I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. "Yeah, I'm fine." He nodded, though I could tell he wasn't convinced. He didn't say anything else though, just turned back to the screen as the movie continued. When it ended, the credits rolled in silence, soft music playing in the background. I stared at the screen, not really seeing it, my thoughts spinning again. Dad didn't move right away either, and for a moment I wondered if he was waiting for me to say something. Finally, he broke the silence. "That was good," he said simply, his voice low. "Really good." "Yeah," I murmured, though my voice felt shaky. "It was." He turned to look at me then, his expression softer than I'd ever seen it. "Ethan," I tensed. "Yeah? You saw yourself in that, didn't you?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. My stomach dropped, and I felt my pulse spike as I stared at him, wide-eyed. I opened my mouth to deny it, to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. I felt frozen, like he'd pulled the rug out from under me. My voice cracked. I couldn't finish. Dad didn't look surprised. He just nodded slowly, as if he'd already known the answer. "It's okay, Ethan," he said softly. "You don't have to say anything if you're not ready." I blinked hard, my vision blurring. "Why are you saying this?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "Why aren't you weirded out or mad or something?" "Because I love you, Dad," replied simply, his voice steady. "And there's nothing wrong with you." And in that moment, we both felt the tension snap. Dad leaned into me while he said those words, and he kissed me, this time more sensitive and way longer. It progressed into heavy kissing, and it felt as if we both had been longing for this for a long time. Eventually, he even told me to go down with my head, and so I did, as a good son should do, and to be honest, it was also very nice for me. I couldn't even resist saying no. After, I think, 10 to 15 minutes, he finished. But my emotions were so high that I couldn't stop my tears from coming. I turned away, wiping at my face with the back of my hand, but it was no use. I hated crying, hated feeling this exposed, but I couldn't hold it in anymore. Dad didn't say anything. He didn't try to force me to talk or make me feel embarrassed. He just sat there, letting me cry until eventually the sobs quieted and my breathing slowed. When I finally looked at him, his expression hadn't changed. He looked at me like he always did, like I was his son and nothing else mattered. "I'm sorry," I muttered, my voice barely above a whisper. "Don't apologize," he said firmly. "You don't have to be sorry for who you are, Ethan, ever." I nodded slowly, the weight on my chest finally starting to lift. "Thanks, Dad." He smiled faintly, reaching over to squeeze my shoulder. "You don't have to figure it all out right now, okay? You've got time." I nodded again, swallowing hard. I know. We sat there in silence for a long time. The only sound, the hum of the air conditioner, and the faint music from the credits still playing on the screen. The room felt different now. Lighter, clearer, like something had finally shifted between us. I didn't have all the answers, but for the first time, I felt like I didn't have to. Dad gave my shoulder one last squeeze before standing up. "Come on," he said, his voice warm. "Let's clean up before your mom gets back." "Yeah," I said softly, standing up to follow him. As we moved around the living room, gathering up empty glasses and snack wrappers, I felt a small smile tug at the corners of my mouth. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid to find out. The living room felt different now, like something heavy had been lifted, leaving a kind of quiet I hadn't felt in years. As Dad and I moved around tidying up before Mom got home, the silence wasn't awkward or tense. It was the kind of quiet you feel when everything that needed to be said had finally been spoken. I picked up an empty soda can from the coffee table and glanced over at Dad. He was wiping down the counter, his movements steady and unhurried. He seemed so normal, like what had happened earlier. Everything I'd admitted, everything we'd shared hadn't changed anything between us. And maybe that was the strangest part of all. "Dad," I said softly, breaking the quiet. He looked up, pausing mid-wipe. "Yeah?" I hesitated, my fingers fidgeting with the can in my hand. Do you ever think about what it would have been like if someone had said this stuff to you when you were my age?" Dad stared at me for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he set the cloth down, leaning against the counter with a thoughtful look on his face. "Yeah," he said finally, his voice quieter now. "I think about it a lot." "What do you mean?" I asked, stepping closer. He let out a small sigh, running a hand through his hair. "When I was your age, Ethan, people didn't talk about things like this. Not in my house. Not anywhere really. You were just supposed to fit the mold. Be who everyone expected you to be." I swallowed hard, my chest tightening. "That sounds lonely." "It was," Dad admitted, his gaze distant. "I spent years trying to convince myself that I could bury the parts of me I didn't understand. That if I ignored them long enough, they'd go away. I felt my throat go dry. Did they?" He shook his head slowly. "Nope, they just got quieter, but they were always there." I watched him carefully, my heart pounding in my chest. This was a part of Dad I'd never seen before, raw, unguarded. For so long, I'd thought of him as this untouchable, unshakable figure. But now I saw him for who he really was. A man who had fought his own battles, who had carried his own burdens. "Is that why you're okay with me?" I asked softly, my voice barely audible. Dad looked up, his eyes meeting mine. "I'm okay with you because you're my son, because I love you. But yeah, maybe part of me wishes I'd had someone like this when I was younger. Someone to tell me it's okay to feel confused or scared or different, that it doesn't make you any less of a person." I blinked quickly, trying to keep the tears at bay. "Thanks, Dad." He gave me a small smile, stepping forward to put a hand on my shoulder. "You don't ever have to go through this alone, Ethan. I'm here, no matter what." I nodded, my chest tight but no longer in a bad way. "I know." We stood there for a moment, the hum of the fridge the only sound in the kitchen. I felt like I'd been given something precious, something I didn't know I needed. Not just Dad's acceptance, but his understanding, his honesty. It made me feel less alone in a way I couldn't explain. After a while, Dad clapped his hands together, breaking the silence. "All right, Mom's gonna be home soon." Think we've got time to sneak in one last round of ice cream before she gets here? I laughed, the sound breaking through the tension like sunlight through clouds. You're unbelievable. Hey, he said, grinning as he opened the freezer and pulled out the half-empty tub. You can't deal with heavy stuff like this without ice cream. It's a law of the universe. I rolled my eyes, grabbing 2 spoons from the drawer. Fine, but you're doing the dishes later. Deal? We sat back on the couch with the ice cream between us, passing the tub back and forth like we used to when I was a kid. The television was still on, though neither of us was really watching. It was just background noise now, something to fill the space. As I dug my spoon into the ice cream, I felt myself relax for the first time in a long time. I wasn't waiting for something bad to happen. I wasn't hiding or running from the truth. I was just here, sitting next to my dad, eating ice cream like everything was normal. And somehow, it was. You know, Dad said suddenly, his tone teasing, you still owe me a rematch on the basketball court. You got lucky today, I snorted. Lucky? I destroyed you. He raised an eyebrow. Keep talking, Ethan. I'll show you what lucky looks like tomorrow. Sure, Dad, I said with a smirk, taking another bite of ice cream. Whatever helps you sleep at night. He laughed, shaking his head as he grabbed the tub back. You're impossible. Wonder where you got that from. I shot back, grinning. Dad just smiled. That familiar, steady look in his eyes, the same one he'd given me earlier when he said it's okay. I couldn't help but smile back. The sound of Mom's car pulling into the driveway broke the moment. Dad looked up, finishing off the last bite of ice cream before standing. Showtime. Think she'll notice we ate half a tub of ice cream? I asked, following him to the kitchen. Nah, he said, rinsing off the spoons. We'll plead ignorance. The front door opened, and Mom's voice rang through the house. I'm back. Did you two eat dinner yet, or am I cooking? Had leftovers, Dad called back casually, winking at me. Welcome home. I grinned, shaking my head as I wiped the counter clean. Mom's footsteps grew closer, and I could hear her sighing as she set her bags down in the hallway. Everything okay while I was gone? She asked, peeking into the kitchen. Perfect, Dad replied easily, leaning back against the counter. Mom's eyes narrowed slightly, like she didn't believe him. What did you two get up to? Guy stuff? Dad said with a shrug. I snorted, grabbing a glass of water to hide my smile. Yeah, just guy stuff. Mom rolled her eyes, muttering something about boys before disappearing toward her room to unpack. When she was gone, Dad glanced over at me, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. We good? He asked softly. I looked at him, my heart full in a way I hadn't felt before. Yeah, we're good. Good, he said, pushing himself off the counter. Now go to bed before I beat you at basketball tomorrow. Dream on, old man. I shot back, grinning as I walked past him. As I climbed the stairs to my room, I felt something settle in my chest, something warm, steady, and unshakable. I didn't have all the answers yet, and maybe I never would, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what came next. I wasn't hiding anymore, and that was enough.